Okay, thank you, Renee. So today I'm going to talk to you about some research I've been doing, part of my PhD, looking at multiple outcomes for biodiversity and carbon in revegetation, supervised by John Dwyer, Kerry Wilson, and in collaboration with Jackie England at SERA and UQ. So we've heard a lot about international commitments at this conference. So you're all familiar with the Yaikiki Biodiversity Target 15 to restore at least 15% of ecosystems by 2020, and then followed up by the 2011 Bond Challenge to restore 150 million hectares by 2020, and then most recently the 2014 New York Declaration on Forests to restore 350 million hectares by 2030, some staggering large-scale restoration. But what these all have in common is that the purposes of them are mainly about climate change mitigation and adaptation and provision of ecosystem services. So this means that we're going to have to do some large-scale restoration, and although the carbon markets do provide an incentive to finance this restoration. So in Australia we have the Emissions Reduction Fund, and that's resulted in many carbon plantings being established in Australia. And carbon plantings do have, financial and carbon benefits, and they do have some environmental benefits too. But they do miss opportunities for, biodiverse plantings that restore native ecosystems, and those missed opportunities include, biodiversity benefits, environmental benefits, and social benefits. And there's been much work in this space looking at biodiversity and co-benefits of carbon plantings and environmental plantings. However, most of the estimates of biodiversity potential have been on vegetation structure and floristic attributes, and they're really focused on flora, not fauna, and without estimates of fauna diversity, they're quite subjective. And we know that fauna recovery can be affected by many things like time lags in the availability of habitat resources for shelter and feeding, and also many landscape level variables as well. So my research question was to determine what are the biodiversity values of different types of revegetation using birds as an indicator of biodiversity value, and what are the synergies and trade-offs with carbon sequestration. And also I wanted to inform decision making on where and how to undertake revegetation to maximise outcomes for both biodiversity and carbon. So SERA led a national research program to estimate biomass accumulation in carbon plantings and environmental plantings, and this was based, over nearly 700 environmental plantings across Australia. And then from this they developed allometric equations so that they could estimate the above-ground biomass in different plant species, and then most recently they developed some universal allometric equations for plant functional types. So I wanted to use that SERA dataset as a basis for my research, but I obviously had to go out and collect more data. So this is a bit of an overview of the methods that I used. So we selected sites, ended up using 14 of the SERA sites, so then had to go out and get more. So found another 16 restoration sites, all in southeast Queensland. We then undertook field surveys at those. We did biocondition sites to get floristics and habitat, a number of things there. And then we did carbon plots, so stem diameter measurements to look at what the biomass would be. We did systematic bird surveys, and then we also undertook some soil sampling. And from that field data, we were able to classify the birds, as whether they were woodland and forest dependent, and also we were interested in species of conservation concern. So we know that the vulnerable bird groups are insectivores, ground nesting birds, understory nesting birds, and small-bodied birds. So we had a number of vegetation attributes as well, and we did some analysis in the lab for the soil, so nitrogen, phosphorus, organic carbon, and looked at a particle size analysis for percentage of clay, silt, sand. And then we used those universal allometric equations to estimate above-ground biomass, so tons per hectare. And we also gathered some climate data and also some landscape attributes as well. And this sort of gives you an overview of the sites that were included. So first up, we've got, farm forestry type planting. So these are native plantations where they had stands of, say, Gympie messmate, spotted gum, and then chinchilla white gum. And then you had more sort of reforestation type sites where they did all the biodiverse tree plantings. This is quite popular, like around water storages. And then you have your more sort of pure ecological restoration sites where they're trying to restore the whole community assemblage. So to try and understand how the system works and to develop some hypotheses, this is sort of our path analysis diagram of what's going on. And I'll just run you through. So our hypotheses were that we thought that, we wanted to look at what the restoration treatment is. So does stem density and woody plant richness, or the climate, so moisture availability, or does the soils, so in this case it shows nitrogen, phosphorus and percentage clay, affect biomass accrual? And then from that we wanted to determine, does biomass accrual then affect tree and shrub cover? And this can also in turn be affected by grazing. And then what affects the richness of woodland forest birds and your functional bird groups? Is it tree and shrub cover, woody plant richness, age, or is it landscape variables or climate variables? And so in that diagram there you can see that the white ones are all your explanatory variables, and the light grey is both response and explanatory, and then the dark grey is just your response variables. And here are some of the results. So because we had quite a lot of collinearity between our variables, we developed a series of competing models to try and understand relationships. So these are the results of the biomass models, and these just plot the regression lines with 95% confidence intervals. So here what we found was what was affecting biomass accrual, so this is tonnes per hectare per year, was actually moisture availability, most significantly. And then we had woody stem density as well as woody plant species richness. And I put up there the clay content relationship because that was quite cool, that quadratic relationship, although that was non-significant. It does sort of show that you having a medium clay content is quite good for growth. And these show what our cover models were, so what influenced tree and shrub cover. So in the first panel we have tree canopy cover, and you can see that biomass accrual did affect that. So when you had more biomass every year, that your tree canopy cover was high, and that was at an exponential rate. And then we also looked at what drove shrub cover. So here the biomass accrual didn't have an effect at all. But what we did find was that cattle grazing, or any grazing, so in our sites we either had significant cattle, and then in other sites where there were no cattle, but they were quite, a lot of them were irrigated with effluent water, so they were quite wet. You had a lot of kangaroo browsing in there as well. So with significant grazing you had a decline in shrub cover, which is to be anticipated. And these graphs now show, what are your predictors of richness of woodland and forest birds. So, again, we have moisture availability as being quite a high predictor, and then, but also your revegetation size. So, the larger the site, the more bird species richness you had. But what we also found again was that your woody plant species richness, that is also is positively correlated with woodland bird species richness. And also, probably it's still significant, but at a weaker effect. And this is probably our worst performing model, but there was still some relationship between tree canopy cover and again bird species richness as well. So what about our species of conservation concern? So this is the models we developed for the small-bodied birds, and this is the species richness of small-bodied birds here. And as you can see, again, moisture availability is a positive predictor of that, as well as revegetation size, and again, woody plant species richness. And these same relationships were more or less, discovered for insectivorous birds as well. We didn't have enough data on ground nesting birds to model that. There wasn't enough, those types of birds that we found in our bird counts. But we did look at understory nesting birds as well. And funnily enough, for understory nesting birds, the significant things that were predicting the species richness were shrub cover, and again, the revegetation size. So in summary, planting in higher rainfall areas and with a diversity of woody plants, or primarily trees, and at a high density, so the high density would promote, tree cover, is good for both biomass accumulation and woodland and forest-dependent birds. And for me, this is quite good that we found something because, you know, the literature up until now has basically said that there's no benefit of planting, you know, more biodiverse plantings, that they don't provide any more biomass over carbon plantings, whereas this is suggesting that if you plant more diverse plantings, that it does have a better growth rate and you will get better biomass accumulation. So, you know, there you can get co-benefits just by planting those types of revegetation for both biodiversity and carbon. But more importantly, planting in larger areas. If you really want to target getting better richness of woodland birds, then planting larger areas is required for that. And all these factors are also good for some of the bird groups in decline, so your small-bodied birds, your insectivorous birds. However, if we want to target understory birds in particular, then we need to be planting a shrub layer. So even though your shrub layer doesn't affect biomass accumulation, it's something you want to consider if you're wanting to target understory birds, which would be in decline. And also, of course, managing grazing would also be part of that if you want your shrub layer to persist. So I wanted to leave some time for questions. This is all quite new, this data, so I'm happy for suggestions. Just about to write this all up. Yeah. Yeah, so all the sites were in southeast Queensland, but we did have a lot of sites which are still within southeast Queensland, but on the other side of the Great Dividing Range. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why you see, just because of the nature of the sites, a lot of the farm forestry sites tended to be on the other side, so they were in drier areas. So that's why you had a bit of collinearity with your variables, which why we couldn't really just throw everything in the same model because, say, for example, moisture availability might have been correlated with cover. Yeah.
Nice presentation, Could you say something about the landscape context? Do you have information on how isolated those plants were from actually that forest, which would affect the colonisation?
Yeah, so we looked at, in terms of the landscape variables for each of the sites, we did the patch size, so how big the revegetation site was, but we also looked at the context. So we used the biocondition method, so within a 1 kilometre buffer of the site, we calculated the percentage of native vegetation, so that's remnant and regrowth vegetation. And that's what I've put in the model so far, but I would quite like to also look at the actual connectivity of that revegetation site, because at the moment they didn't come back with anything significant. But I think that they could have something to do with the size of the site, because if the site was bigger, then it was, that 1 kilometre buffer was incorporating either some of its own vegetation or sometimes that vegetation is not mapped yet, by the state, so it wouldn't be. So I would quite like to also look at the actual, connectivity of the site in terms of the perimeter, how much of the actual perimeter of that revegetation site joins other native vegetation. So I will do that still and see if, because it's surprising to me that that was not significant, because I would have thought that both size and context would have been important for birds especially. Yeah.
How are you including future disturbances such as fire? Because all of those benefits could be undone or not regenerated with fire and disturbance.
Well, yeah, disturbance, you could easily put that in that Parthenos diagram, because disturbances are not just grazing, they're climatic, fire, and I think, yes, there are unknowns and there is uncertainty in it, but I'm not attempting to explain everything. Yeah.
Okay, so we might hold it there. Thank you, Valerie. Next up, we have Sally Utar.
Good afternoon. My name's Sally Cooper and I'm an environmental scientist for Tweed Shire Council. I'm also doing Masters part-time with Southern Cross University, and I'm going to talk today a little bit about some of my Masters research. So most of us involved in ecological restoration have grappled with the P word, provenancing. Many of us have wondered at some point whether we should source our seed locally or from further afield, or perhaps a combination is best. And what does local mean anyway to the provenance of a plant? Surely it varies considerably depending on the species. These are some questions that I've personally agonised over, and I think I'm not alone. I want to understand if it's better to use locally sourced seed or apply local provenancing to ecological restoration, and specifically to subtropical rainforest restoration. This is what's led me to undertake a master's research on this topic. And as part of that research, I have undertaken an industry survey which was designed to canvass the perspectives of restoration practitioners, particularly in relation to matters that affect genetic diversity and provenancing. And it's the results of this survey that I'm going to focus on today. I suspect most people in this room are pretty familiar with the concept of provenancing, but for those who aren't, the provenance of a seed is its geographic origin, and another way to put that is to say that the provenance of a seed is its harvest location. So why do we need to concern ourselves with provenancing anyway? Well, provenancing matters because where a seed is sourced largely determines its genetic makeup. And the genetic makeup of those individuals that we plant at a site collectively determines the gene pool of that restored community. Insufficient variation in that community can risk its successful establishment or persistence. Genetic variation or genetic diversity is important because it affects the functionality and the resilience of a community. The way that genetic diversity influences the functionality of a community is through variations in traits, such as growth rates, disease resistance, reproductive success, and recovery from extreme weather events, such as flood and drought. Essentially, genetic diversity is an insurance policy for a plant population to sustain itself under changing environmental conditions. The hypothesis for my research is that restored rainforest communities are not capturing the genetic diversity of their remnant reference communities, and that perhaps outdated perspectives on genetic diversity and provenancing, as well as those workplace constraints, are contributing to genetically depauperate restored rainforest communities. The objectives of this component of my research is to investigate and understand the perspectives of practitioners and understand their work practices in relation to seed collection and planting strategies. The industry survey involved an online questionnaire which targeted rainforest restoration practitioners in northeast New South Wales and southeast Queensland, and practitioners were categorised into two cohorts: seed collectors and native nursery workers, and bush regenerators and land managers. So is local seed best? Well, in order to answer this question, we first need to define local. The industry survey dealt with this question by asking participants to tell us which definition of local provenancing best fit their understanding. The definition that was most preferred was that local provenancing is seed which is sourced from the estimated dispersal or pollination range of target species. So practitioners understand that the boundary of local is dependent on the range of these pollinators and seed dispersers. And so practitioners understand that gene flow is what determines provenance boundaries. The purpose of this slide is to illustrate how plant DNA moves throughout the landscape under a natural plant population. Most flowering plants reproduce sexually, so they have a combination of maternal and paternal DNA. And so the paternal genetic material is transferred through the landscape as pollen by pollinators such as this native bee. If a flower is successfully fertilised, it produces an embryo, often in the form of a fruit or a berry. That embryo, which contains the maternal and paternal DNA, is transferred throughout the landscape by seed dispersers, such as this bird. And so you can see that the genetic makeup of a population or its gene pool is dependent on the movement patterns of these pollinators and seed dispersers. Contrast that situation with that of a restored community, where you have primarily humans as the collectors and transporters of plant DNA. From the seed collector, who selects the parent trees, collects the seed and transports it to the nursery, where the seed's then propagated and seedlings are produced. The bush regenerators then come to the nursery and collect a selection of those seedlings and transport them to the restoration site and plant them out. And so you can see clearly how heavily humans are involved in this process. So what if we don't get it right? If the seed collector fails to collect adequate variation in the seed collected, or the bush regenerators only receive a small selection of the variability, then the restored community could have reduced genetic variability. And that could impact on its ecological fitness and adaptive potential. We know that practitioners in this region do understand the importance of genetic diversity. In our industry survey, we posed a statement and asked whether they agreed or disagreed. And this statement was, maximising genetic diversity in restored rainforest communities is important to their long-term conservation in the face of changing environmental conditions. And as you can see from the graph, most agreed. The different coloured bars relate to the different cohorts of practitioners, but the take-home message being that rainforest restoration practitioners in this region understand that genetic diversity is important. So given that we understand genetic diversity is important, how are we going about achieving that in our restored communities? If you look to the industry guidelines, they provide some strategies. Some of these include to ensure that seeds collected from an adequate number of parent plants, and while that varies a little depending on the industry guideline, the general rule of thumb is to ensure that it's a minimum of 10. The other strategy that's recommended in the guidelines is to ensure that those parent plants are adequately spaced apart. And those, the rule of thumb there is 100 metres for trees and 50 metres for shrubs. So how are practitioners in this region faring with regards to these recommendations? Well, in short, they're generally not meeting the recommended number of parent trees to collect seed from. Typically, or most commonly, people are collecting from 2 to 5 parent plants. Some are collecting up to 10, but few are collecting more than that minimum recommended number. How about in relation to the distance between parent plants? How are practitioners in this region faring in that regard? Well, generally, most people are collecting from parent plants which are spaced 11 to 50 metres apart. Sometimes they were collecting from parent plants which are spaced more than 1 kilometre, but what practitioners told us that sometimes the distance just depends on their knowledge of where those other parent trees are. So in summary, from these results, it seems that seed collectors are generally not meeting those industry standards in terms of number of parent trees or spacings between parent trees in their seed collections. So what other strategies are there to maximise genetic diversity in our restored communities? In the industry survey, we listed several strategies and we asked participants to rate the effectiveness of those strategies as they saw it. The most effective, according to the respondents, was to obtain stock or seed from remnant rainforest or from within the disperser or pollinator range of remnant rainforest. A clear preference there for using stock from remnant forest, which makes sense. But what was interesting to me in this result was the strategy that was considered least effective at maximising genetic diversity, and that was the use of non-local provenance seed. So practitioners in this region seem to be still favouring local provenancing, or they don't seem to think that the use of non-local seed is an effective means to maximise genetic diversity. Local provenancing isn't the only seed sourcing strategy. There's numerous others that I don't have time to go into today, but anyone who's not familiar with these other strategies, I highly recommend that you look into them. What's interesting about these other strategies is that they all include the use of non-local seed as a means to maximise or improve genetic diversity. In our write-up of these results, we provided some practical recommendations for practitioners, how you can maximise genetic diversity in your restoration projects. And these include to collect seed from naturally occurring populations which are large and well connected, to collect seed from a high number of well-spaced parent trees, to strategically include non-local seed, and refrain from exclusively requiring local seed in revegetation contracts, to source seedlings from a number of different nurseries, and to supplementary plant over a number of years. If you want more research, more information on this research, there's the paper to go to. But if anyone has any questions, in the meantime, I can ask.
Sally, do we have any questions on the floor?
Sally, how many practitioners did you sample?
Yeah, so the sample's pretty small because it's only a small region, but and there was about 60% that actually started it, that actually finished the survey. So I think it was about 60, yeah, in the end.
Any other questions?
Slides. Okay.
The slides, if you want the pointer, it's that
Oh,
bit
that's
at
on
the
there,
top.
right?
Yep.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Well, we might make a change now to another set of islands to the north of Australia. The last presentation was to the south. And what I want to talk about here is a model that we've been looking at for peatland restoration in central Kalimantan. So first of all, I'd like to just introduce some of the other people working with us. It's Tim Jessup and Marcel Silvius, who have been working in peatlands for many years, particularly Marcel. Blair Freeman and Julia Fidelis from Indo4 in Victoria, and Alu Dohong, who recently completed his PhD at this university. What we'll talk about this afternoon is, I'll just introduce a little bit about Indonesia's peatlands for those who are not familiar with it. I'll talk about how we got to this degraded state, or how the peatlands got to this degraded state, and then introduce this idea of the landscape restoration, focusing on the protected areas, the buffer zones around those protected areas, and then the mineral soils which lie just outside it. And then taking this landscape one step further into developing this jurisdictional platform. For those that aren't familiar with Indonesia, there's a few of the photos there, some of the canal blocking, some of the revegetation, fish farming, which is a very big part of the restoration process, and Melaleuca, Leucodendra exploitation. So Indonesia's peatlands, for those that are unfamiliar, Indonesia contains probably 45% of the world's peatlands, or tropical peatlands, and that includes some of the newly discovered areas in the Central Africa, particularly in Congo, and more now within Latin America. It's a considerable part of the world. So these peatlands, or domes as we call them, are actually dome-shaped, and they're consisting mainly of this woody peat material, and they support these tropical peat swamp forests, and they're the home of the famous orangutan. So very important from a biodiversity conservation point. In Indonesia, in Indonesia, most of the peatland here shown in red lie in the coastal areas, and they're concentrated in the island of Borneo, Sumatra, and here in Papua. So what leads to deforestation, and what leads to the peatland degradation is, first of all, the deforestation, then the drainage, and then the fire. They're basically the three. And to just highlight that, in the 2015 fires, which was the last big El Nino event, they caused about $16 billion damage and burned about 2.6 million hectares. In the previous El Nino event in 97-98, the damage was about 9.6 billion hectares, and the area burnt was 9.7 million hectares. So fire is a major issue in terms of this degradation, and I think we'll talk about that later. So the peatland degradation. Following this forest clearing and then the drainage, which is caused by these canals, we get the peat subsides. It goes down, and that's basically just subsidence as the water flows out. And then the other part of this is the oxidation process, from biological oxidation and from fire. So these are the things that really push it. And so one of the real issues is that this oxidation and the greenhouse gas emissions associated with it, that'll continue forever and a day, or until we reach the groundwater level. So it can go on, and with a subsidence rate of 2 to 6 centimetres a year, you can see that over 100 years, Indonesia is going to lose 3 metres of its land, and that results in regular and prolonged flooding, particularly on the edges of these domes. If you look at what's happened in Holland over the last 800 years, they've lost 8 metres of peat in that same period. We think the oxidation rates in Indonesia are going to be much higher than they are in Holland. It's a serious issue. In terms of the carbon, 15 centimetres of peat, 1 hectare, 15 centimetres, contains the same amount of carbon as a normal tropical forest. The difference here, or the thing to remember here, is that those emissions are going to be continuing every year. So we're losing roughly this 1 hectare of peat forest or equivalent every year, until that peat subsides down to the groundwater level. So it's not just a one-off event. You know, we all complain about, we lost a hectare of tropical forest. That's a little bit incidental compared with this continual process every year. So what happens is, here's a dome, usually roughly 20 kilometres wide. Most of the forest, or the good forest, is on the edges. That gets logged first. The remnant vegetation on the top part of the dome, and then, of course, through to the canal, the construction of the canals, we end up with this mini dome effect, which is where the canals are. So here's a shot of a LiDAR of an actual dome in central Kalimantan, and you can see the top part of that dome sort of roughly flattens out, and you can see from these spikes here, which is the vegetation, it's very little vegetation is on that dome. So the specific research in Kalimantan has indicated explicit links between the livelihood-based land preparation, and there's many other anthropogenic factors associated with this, drainage and rainfall variance, and they're the causes of fire in these peatlands. Now, not all of these peatland fires are peat fires, so there's two distinct differences. We have surface fires, which some of this is, and then we have peat fires, which probably that is. So, but one thing we do know is that all fires are anthropogenic. There are no natural fires in Indonesia, apart from some spontaneous combustion of piles of coal that are sitting on the edges of rivers. So this canal construction that I talked about leads to drainage of the peatland and a decline in water, groundwater levels, because it all drains out to the rivers, and then this loss of peat through this subsidence and oxidation. So let's have a look at the integrated approach now. So we've been looking at this, the peat dome as this hydrological unit, and that broadly defines the ecosystem. And so these areas, or these peat units, are roughly 100 to 100,000 hectares in area. And one of the important things to understand in this integrated approach to restoration is that the units extend beyond the boundaries of villages, so they've got village boundaries covering the whole thing. We've got concession boundaries for carbon concession, restoration concessions. They cover the whole thing. They're also superimposed by forest management units, which are on top of that, and we've got district and provincial boundaries on top of that. So it's a very interesting landscape in which to work. So here we see that we've got those hydrological units basically run from the river to the river, and it's this central part of the dome which we want to protect or to rehabilitate. That's the deep peat. That's where all the carbon is, and that's what we're trying to protect. And here you show the influence of these canals which run through the degraded peatland. So we know that the fire that occurs in these areas and the water draining off them, it runs across all of these management boundaries. So that's why this ecosystem restoration is really the way to go we think, to reduce fires, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, restore these functional attributes of these peatland areas, improve livelihoods and businesses. And we think that these last two are the key. These are the key, really, to this whole process of more sustainable restoration. So the critical steps to minimise fires, which results in the loss of vegetation and the assets, causes all the smoke and haze that we see each year coming out of Indonesia. We're trying to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions and to protect the deep peat and implement these peat restoration strategies. They include, first of all, determining the land tenure and planning at a jurisdictional level and at the local and village level. Most important, there's a lot of consultation process at all levels to actually get that started. We really need to get a jurisdictional commitment to engage all the stakeholders. Undertaking the hydrological rehabilitation on the deep peat also needs high level of consultation with communities as well as local government, same with the reforestation. And the consultation process, although it's last here in the list, is really very, very important to identify those sustainable land use practices and those improved livelihoods for local communities in the buffer zone. So what we've done is we've zoned this peatland area. So this is the central part of the deep peat, and that's got to be protected. This is the area that has the reforestation activities and the constraints on other uses. And if you're listening to Bill Jackson yesterday, this is where some of these trade-offs come into play, whereby trying to entice communities not to damage this area, but move into this outer ring, which is where, in the buffer zone on the shallower peat, where we can have enterprises involving the melaleuca, agroforestry, and of course the honey production. outside of this area is the mineral soils, and this is, before we talked about what is the size of the landscape. It's not just the hydrological unit, but it's got to go outside of that, because those community boundaries are outside that hydrological unit. And so those villages are cut across all of this area. So it's very important to include this area outside. And that's where some of the largest scale industries or enterprises might be undertaken. So we've done some work on suitable commodities that might fit with the various, within the hydrological unit, and we've undertaken some financial models of some of the commodities which either the communities talked about, the local governments talked about, or the provincial governments thought were useful. And one of the interesting things here is in the shallow peat, I showed you pictures before of fish ponds. In one of the areas that we're looking at, freshwater fish is a really big industry. And we couldn't work this out for a while, and then we found out that part of that population are working in Saudi Arabia, and they really love dried salted fish. And it produced this massive market from some of these areas. So you've got to really spend a lot of time understanding and communicating with the communities to actually figure out what they want and how they're going to work to undertake this process. So doing the landscape model is all very well and good, but if you can imagine an area the size of 4 or 5 million hectares, having a few landscape restoration projects dotted around, it's going to be useful, but we need a way of actually bringing those together. And as the provinces are now in Indonesia are the jurisdictional unit responsible for land use management. So what we're trying to do is develop this mechanism to coordinate and bundle the management of these peatland landscapes. One of the important things we've found out from investors and others, and particularly the government, is that they want this jurisdictional platform, and it's mainly to support this investment into green growth within these landscapes and bring together financial backers. They want more than just 100,000 hectares. And most importantly, the MRV methodologies. In Indonesia, Indonesia's got a carbon accounting system at the national level, but there's how do we incorporate the carbon accounting at the provincial or district level, and also with all of the voluntary market projects which operate at a totally different tier. This is just some of the key sectors and the outcomes of this jurisdictional approach. And what we're really aiming for is a restored and protected and well-managed peatland with sustainable and profitable livelihoods. So thank you very much.
Keeping to time, we won't have any questions, but please approach Grahame in the break. So final speaker for this session is Laura Grahame. I was a bit confused.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So I work for BOSS, which is the Borneo Orangutan Survival Foundation, and we're based out of central Kalimantan in Indonesia. I'm a project leader within BOSS. We partner with multiple GOs and NGOs on various different projects and academic institutes. And I'd like to talk to you today about two of the projects which I work on. There's intentionally a lot of logos on the screen at the moment, a lot of institutes involved in these two projects. And that's one of the points I want to make today, because I want to talk about Indonesia's haze crisis. And it is a crisis. It's an extremely complicated, difficult problem. Grahame's already given some really nice background on tropical peatlands and its degradation. I'll add a little bit more to that. But this problem has been at a peak consistently for the last 20 years, and restoration efforts and putting out the fires in a sustainable long-term way has been
attempted for the last 20 years, and we're still having major problems with this. We need multi-sector, interdisciplinary projects and people working together, and we need efforts that are grounded in data and in accuracy, and then we need to be conveying these results quickly and in a usable fashion to the policymakers and the stakeholders on the ground. So as Grahame already gave you a little bit of background, Grahame is also working on these two projects. We've both been working together in central Kalimantan for the last 10 years. Tropical peatlands are extremely important. Indonesia hosts some of the world's, the majority of the world's tropical peatlands. We recently discovered in Congo a large extent as well, but Indonesia may still hold that title. But in any rate, it is 200,000 square kilometres. The environmental services that it provides include obviously the orangutan and gibbon, the sun bears, the clouded leopards, and other less well-known but equally important biodiversity. Extremely important from hydrological and nutrient cycling and management for the area, and of course the massive carbon storage, which Grahame talked about. But it's also for the local communities. The forests themselves provide multiple alternative livelihoods, such as fishing, hunting, and non-timber forest product collection, but also culturally and for the local religion, for spiritual and local identities. Much of local culture here is related to the environment and to the forest. Unfortunately, not much of that forest is left. Latest data suggests that around 5 or 6% can actually be classified as non-degraded. And between 1985 and 2006, we lost about 50% of the tropical peatlands, so they became degraded. This degradation happens through logging initially, and then conversion into agriculture and plantations. And then in order to do that, they want to drain the peat, which leads to the peat drying and oxidizing and resulting in fires. And once this degradation has happened, we lose all these environmental and community benefits and services. And once it becomes degraded, it's not a case of, oh, you know, if we take the cattle off, in the case of South America, if we take the cattle off, the forest will grow back. It becomes a cycle of degradation that's very difficult to get out of, and the forest just becomes dominated instead by this wasteland of fern and sedges that really doesn't have a lot of use. So the upper image, this was September, one day in September. This image is from NASA. All the red marks show hotspots or fire locations. So Indonesia was literally on fire during the September and October in 2015. This shows Sumatra and the plumes of smoke that are just heading straight into Singapore and Malaysia. This is my hometown, Palangkaraya in central Kalimantan. Just to add a personal perspective on this, I have two kids, a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old. My 3-year-old was 3 months old when this was happening, and we're fortunate. We have, you know, AC and air filters in our home. Many people live in wooden houses in this area. There was no escape from this. So obviously this has health and safety impacts, greenhouse gas emission impacts, and one of the projects I work on looks at what was in this smoke, and it's not just carbon emissions, it's full of nitrous oxides, sulfurous oxides, carcinogens that are going straight into the local community's lungs. So, where do we go from here? Many landscape-scale rehabilitation projects have been tried. We've learned a lot. We've built up a lot of capacity and knowledge. After the 2015 fires, the Ministry of Environment and Forestry of Indonesia approached ACR and suggested developing a research project together, which would be interdisciplinary, multi-sector, and aim on addressing the haze crisis through improving livelihoods and restoring the peatlands. The project initially has a 4-year timeline, but ACR has already indicated that they would like to see this project continue for at least 10 years, which is the kind of timeline you need for addressing this kind of problem. And we're really, it's not an implementation project, it is research, but it's trying to understand and better address the research gaps that would underpin figuring out how we can move and transition biophysically and socially towards ending this haze crisis. So the project is based around 5 objectives. So just to explain this diagram to you, up at the top, back in the 1980s, we had a lot of tropical peatlands still left. Indonesian policies at the time provided little incentive to reduce or prevent unwanted fires in peatlands. So communities, plantations and industry would use this land for a wide range of uses, including with fire. It's leading to drainage, lots of conversion, lots of land usage, which of course resulted ecologically in the degradation of the environment, which endpoint is the fire and haze. So we're trying to reverse this pattern. So across here, you've got multidisciplines. And so the ACR project has been developed with 5 objectives, each one loosely within a discipline. So objective 1 is the fire ecology, trying to better understand how the fires behave and allow for better management. Objective 3, these aren't in any nice sequential order. Objective 3 is looking at the biophysical properties of the peat and being able to indicate and quantify where we are in that degradation to restoration spectrum. This would be the social and economic discipline of trying to improve, better understand and improve livelihoods for the men and women. And then policy and land management over here, trying to improve provide better policy and better land management that will avoid fires. And then objective 5, which underpins them all, is to do with knowledge management and capacity building, so that we're not just doing research and learning things, but it's being quickly conveyed across to the government parties and to the stakeholders that need it. So where we're working, this is Sumatra and this is Kalimantan. The red lines show our 2 projects. And going back to that hotspot map, you can see that we're in areas which burn regularly and where the tropical peatlands are. So the objective that I work within is objective 1, and so we're trying to better understand the socio-economic and biophysical drivers of peatland fires through direct research, which I'll talk a bit further about in a second. But that's in order that we can better target and improve land management practices on the ground. This might be that we better understand the social activities that lead to the peat fires. It might be that we better understand the high-risk areas with the high fuel loads that we can target and have rapid response if a fire emerges there. And then hopefully this data will also allow us to have a peat fire danger rating system. There's lots of fire danger rating systems out there, but they're not talking about peat fires, and as Grahame explained, they're very different. If it's a surface fire, if it goes down into the peat, the emissions and also how you can manage and put out that fire are 2 very different things. So we need to start people talking about peat fires, not just peatland surface fires. So one of the nice things about this project, as I said, there's lots of projects, there's lots of people, there's lots of activities in this space. We do know a lot already, and there's no point reinventing the wheel. So one of the first tasks within the ACR project is to do a review and develop a working paper. Each of the objectives is going to see who else is working in this space, what's been published, and build upon that knowledge. And then also we're already developing the stakeholder engagements, workshops, focus groups to ensure that we have people working on the ground directly with the implementers, the practitioners and the government so that our results are being directly used. And so this takes me to the other project which I work on, which is the University of Maryland sorry, I forget what the CES stands for, Centre of Environmental Studies, working with the Institute of Pertanian Bogor, which is a big university in Indonesia, the Peat Fire Research Project. And we're looking at how fires transition from, as I say, from these surface fires down into the peat, because that's really key in terms of emission calculations. So we've been working on this project since 2014. The first 3 years, the first phase of the project, we're just working in the Bos area in central Kalimantan, developing methodology. And I don't know if you've had a chance to see this, but we have a poster out in the main area that describes these methodology, because there's not currently international standardized methodology for how you record tropical peat fires and how you monitor them. So now we've published a book on these methods. It's a field operating manual where we hope that we can get people all using the same methodology to record tropical peat fires and the emissions that are coming out of them. And so phase 2 of the project was to, rather than just working in one location in central Kalimantan, we're working all the way across to Jambi, Papua and Riau with the project. And so the ACR project started about this time, and so we partnered with the ACR project. So these methodology are going straight into the ACR project to be used as well. And this is, as I was saying, so where we're really trying to get to and what the end goal is that we have national level methodology, that we're working together as a team. And so this is, as you saw at the beginning, there are multiple academic, government, NGO institutes working on this, but we're using consistent methodology. We're actually having training events together. Later in the year, we're going to have a database management meeting together across all of these projects and institutes. And so by collecting this data directly, by being able to convey it out to the stakeholders quickly, as far as I can see, this is perhaps one of the best routes in hoping to address this haze crisis with us all working together. And so you can see here we've got landscape coverage. The pale blue shows all the provinces that these two projects together are working in. The dark blue shows the peatlands. So we're starting to get national level data. And that's it. Thank you very much.